short introduction on how to do a sumo deadlift. My name is Grace, I'm the coach here at the Barbell Club. So I'm going to take you through a few pointers that you might want to keep in mind if you are giving sumo a go for the first time. So the first thing you want to think about is your foot positioning. Obviously sumo differs from conventional in that the stance is a lot wider. I'm going to talk a little bit later as to how to figure out if that's particularly suitable for you. But I personally always use the rings in the knurling as a little bit of a reference point. And it doesn't matter too much exactly how wide or narrow you're going with your stance. Of course, we're not coming here, we're not in a conventional stance, but use those little rings as a bit of a guide for you. So wherever you set up, try and keep it consistent each time. You might need to do a little bit of playing around with this to figure out what works for you. But hopefully once you've got yourself set up, you should be feeling pretty comfortable with your feet in a set position. Most people typically sumo with a little bit of external rotation going on in their feet. Again, have a little experiment with this to see what works best for you. My stance personally is a little bit more externally rotated, so I'm going to turn my toes out a little bit. The next thing you want to think about is obviously grabbing the bar. So you want to have your hands no wider really than shoulder width. If you notice here, if you have your hands too wide, obviously when you go to grab the bar, your shins and your quads are going to be in the way as you come to lock it out. So you want to think as a starting point, have your wrists sort of in line with your shoulders, so when you reach down, you can grab the bar with both hands. As you're coming down, you also want to think about your leg positioning, and a cue that I often use when I'm coaching people in the sumo is to think about building a house with your legs. So what I mean by that is keeping your ankles and your knees stacked on top of each other, and also thinking about some external rotation. So for your start positioning, really pushing your knees out. If your knees are collapsing in, this is obviously not going to put you in a particularly strong position and could increase the risk of you getting a bit hurt in your adductors or your hamstrings. So think about building that house. Ankles and knees are stacked, one on top of the other, and then reaching down to grab the bar. You then want to take a nice deep breath in, embrace, and get your hips into your start position. Now obviously your start position is going to be specific for you, whether you are attempting sumo or conventional, and again you might need to just play around with this for a little while to figure out what works for you. In either case of either a conventional or a sumo deadlift, what we don't want is a lot of hip shift going on. So this is where it might be useful to film your videos and see what's happening. If you're noticing when you initiate the lift, your hips are coming up quite a lot, it might mean that your hips are too low, and vice versa. So once you've found that position, big breath in, push off the floor, and then push your hips through at the top. One thing you really don't want to think about in sumo is really trying to initiate the lift by pulling with your back. Always think push from the floor, find that stack in your joints, and then to lock it out, push your hips through at the top, shoulders back. When you're turning the bar to the floor, always think as well, push your hips back instead of guiding the bar down over your knees. I'll show you what I mean. When we're returning the bar to the floor, we don't want to let the bar hit the knees. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how to find a hip position that is going to work for you. So as I said before, if you're noticing when you review your training footage that you're seeing a lot of hip shift, either up or down, as you initiate the lift, this means that your hip positioning is potentially not as good as it could be, and ultimately you want it in a position that feels really strong for you to help you lift the most. So what I tend to do when I'm trying to figure that out for a client, or when I was figuring it out for myself, is think about that point where your hips start to feel a bit like a lever. So you're pushing your hips down, feeling that engagement through your hamstrings and your quads before you even lift. Quite a helpful thing that I've found to help really increase awareness around that hip positioning is something called an iso hold at the bottom of your lift. So what you could do is play around with finding that position where you can, again, think about your hips as a lever, pushing your hips down, really feeling your feet into the floor, feeling your hamstrings and your quads start to engage, and from there hold the bar, taking the slack out of the bar. So maybe the bar starts to lift a little bit off the floor. You want this to happen without some kind of weird shooting thing happening. So I'll do that again. What we don't want is a lot of movement in hips. I'm obviously over-exaggerating. What you want to do is really take the slack, big brace, feel your hamstrings engage, push those knees out, push off the floor and push your hips through at the top. Another way that you can tell if your hips and your shoulders are in the right position to start off with is if you view your footage from the side. So film yourself doing a couple of sets and notice where your shoulders are in relation to your knees. So if your shoulders are really, really far back, it probably means your hips are sat a little bit too low. So if you can see from the side, my shoulders are going to be behind my knees. So if I were to draw a vertical line down the middle of my side profile, my shoulders would be behind the knees. You also don't want the shoulders too far forward because that can indicate that your hips are too high. So you want to find that sort of spot in between, using the knees and shoulders as a rough guide. There's also a couple of different ways that you can grab the bar. So we can go for double overhand, mixed grip, either left under, right over, or left over, right under, or hook thumbs inside the rest of the fingers. The one problem you're probably going to have with sumo is most of the time your grip is going to line up somewhere between the knurling and the smooth part of the bar. The only way around this really is to practice it and use lots of chalk. And the last few things I'm going to talk about in this video are some programming considerations that you might want to take into account when you are giving sumo a go. So the first thing I'd say is if you have never tried sumo before, or you've maybe never deadlifted before, the best way to figure out whether sumo is suitable for you is maybe to run it for a block and then run conventional for a block and then see which one you feel more comfortable in. Especially if you are training to compete, then the one that you feel strongest in is probably going to be the best one for you to stick with. Leading on from that, I often get asked, should you do sumo to sort of benefit your conventional deadlift, or should you do conventional to benefit your sumo? I would say that unless you are particularly experienced in both, the thing that I would best advise is to only really do conventional to strengthen sumo, but don't just try and do sumo to somehow strengthen conventional unless you've already learned lift. It's quite a technical lift, and I think it's best probably to focus on making yourself as strong as you possibly can in the one that you prefer. The last thing you might be thinking of is, well, when do I max out in this lift? How do I figure out how strong I actually am in my sumo deadlift? And my advice would be probably train for a competition, potentially work with a coach if you want to actually learn to max out safely and peak properly. But if you are looking to max something out, then just make sure you've got all of the technique dialed down first before you go ahead and just try and go for that 1 rep max. So I hope you have enjoyed this video today, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them below or get in touch with us on Instagram.